So you all should see it pop up now. Great, thanks. So again, I'm Mideast, Director of Outreach and Development. We are recording this conversation. Thank you all for joining us. As for many of you who have been with us before, you know sort of the format. We will ask that you hold questions till the end, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. It's great to see some new faces, and as always, our loyal friends and supporters. For those of you who are new to the event, we created the Ambassador Circle event as a way to help bring Israel and Israeli leaders and US leaders and thinkers together to give you an inside peek at current event and issues beyond what you might see in the headlines. As many of you know, prior to October 7th, we had a real growing disconnect between North American Jewry and Israel. And one of the things that we try to do is show the commonalities between both sides, not only the things that divide. And there is a major swath of Israelis that share the same values and aspirations, and we are proud to be able to connect Israelis to this and connect you to them. We have always strived to bring an impressive cadre of speakers. Today's guests are no exception. All of our speakers volunteer their time, which really, I think Mayor will not say this, but this is really because of their respect and admiration for the work that he has done in Tel Aviv for 30 plus years, what the Daniel Centers has done. And we're really humbled by this generosity of time of our speakers. And this also only happens because of donors and supporters and our board members and everyone who cares and loves and shares the same mission and values that we do. So thank you to all. So now I'd love to introduce Rabbi David Saperstein, who most of you know from his amazing 40 years as head of the Religious Action Center. He most recently served as the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. I could go on, but I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Saperstein.
David, unmute yourself.
Okay, it is a pleasure to be with everyone here. To Ambassador Ross, Dennis, I just want to reintroduce you to the community of Beit-Daniel, our largest synagogue in Israel, and a following of supporters amongst Reformed Jewish leaders across the globe. And these sessions bring together the global community in support of Beit-Daniel, and really delighted that you're with us here. And at this crossroads moment for America and crossroads period for Israel, it's an honor and always a pleasure, Dennis, to introduce Ambassador Dennis Ross, one of America's leading Middle East experts who has served in 6 administrations to this community. I've been lobbying for the Reformed Jewish movement from President Carter through President Biden, and Ambassador Ross has played significant roles in almost every one of those administrations. Currently, he is the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. That's a think tank which all of us in D.C. turn to and rely on constantly for insightful understanding of the dynamics in the Near East, Middle East region. And Dennis also teaches at Georgetown University's Center for Jewish Civilization. For 12 years, he played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties in both the first Bush administration and the entirety of the 8 years of Bill Clinton's administration. Instrumental in helping Israelis and Palestinians reach the 95 interim agreement. He helped successfully broker the 97 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 94 Israel-Jordan peace treaty, and he would later serve as a special advisor to Secretary of State Clinton on Iran, who had an issue that is of central importance to us at this particular moment. 5 books dealing with varied aspects of the Middle East, Israel and the U.S.-Israel relations, and so much more. You should just know at a crucial moment in world history before the Clinton administration, Ambassador Ross served as the director of the State Department's policy planning staff, an absolutely key position at the State Department during the first Bush administration. He played a prominent role in U.S. policy towards the former Soviet Union during that transition period, the end of the Cold War, the unification of Germany and its integration into NATO. He was involved in arms control negotiations, the 91 Gulf War coalition building. In other words, our speaker today brings deep and abiding knowledge across the breadth of American foreign policy on all things Israel, and with deep sensibilities about the American Jewish community. And to lead our discussion with Ambassador Ross, we have Ofer Chizik with us, a long-time respected reporter and writer for Ynet, the widely read website of Yediot Achronot, Israel's largest paid newspaper. Equally important for our movement, Ofer is now a rabbinical student at HUC and serving as a spiritual leader for one of the congregations in the amazing Daniel Center complex. Dennis, thank you for joining us. Ofer, I turn this over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador Ross, for this amazing opportunity to hear your thoughts today. And just before we start, I want to send our peace and prayers to those of us joining now from the West Coast. So to start, Ambassador Ross, you were in the rooms in which peace was almost established in the 90s. Now we're 30 years later, and it seems that peace is yet so far that it's almost unimaginable from the Israeli perspective. Can you please describe to us how did we get from the most optimistic days that we had in the 90s to the place in which we are now?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Thank you, David, for introducing me. David and I have known each other a long time, and we've also experienced the highs and lows of a lot of emotions related to the heart of your question. If I were to say the one thing that was probably most instrumental in sort of undermining the possibility of peace, it was the Second Intifada, because the Second Intifada killed a peace camp in Israel. It came at a time really in the context of Israel having the most forthcoming government in its history. It wasn't, people tend to misread the history in some respects. Yes, it's true that Yasser Arafat said no to everything at Camp David, but that was less important than he said no to the Clinton parameters at the end of the Clinton administration. The Clinton parameters would have created a Palestinian state in 100% of Gaza, 97% of the West Bank. It basically was being offered with an Israeli government that accepted it. He not only rejected it, he also, in effect, decided to do a second intifada. And I say that he decided because, in fact, he could have stopped it and he didn't. And more than that, I know for a fact that the entire Palestinian delegation that was negotiating, that received the Clinton parameters, December 22nd, the year 2000, the entire delegation wanted to accept it, and Arafat rejected it. I think Arafat was influenced in part by the fact that he never foreclosed an option, but I think it was also something else. My very worst meeting with Arafat was right after the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, May 22nd, the year 2000. It was the worst meeting I ever had with him. This is a guy who basically never swore, and every other word was a swear word, because he said, look how this makes me look. I'm criticized for getting crumbs from the Israelis. Hezbollah drives the Israelis out. They withdraw. Hezbollah opens the prisons. I think at that moment is when he decided he was going to have, he would follow a kind of model like Hezbollah, will do violence, but will negotiate at the same time. He dramatically underestimated at his own cost what the consequence of that would be. A little bit like the miscalculations of Sinwar, of Nasrallah, and of the Supreme Leader. A fundamental miscalculation, which ultimately leads to the demise of Arafat. But if you ask me what transformed the landscape, it was the Second Intifada. Now, we've gone a long ways from that. October 7, 2023, which obviously you haven't asked about yet. I'm probably anticipating a question, But I just want to say, I think,
Start with it.
okay, well, I think, look, the reality here is that October 7th, 2023 has further transformed the Israeli body politic. It's not that I'm without hope, and we can get into why I retain hope. Part of that is probably congenital, but the reality is it is not just this Israeli government that is against the idea of a Palestinian state. There's a majority of Israelis today who are against a Palestinian state, not because they have thought through at this point what the relationship with Palestinians should be, but because they still bear the trauma of October 7th. And they can't imagine that a Palestinian state would, in the end, not be led by Hamas or extremists like Hamas. So we have to get beyond that. We are in an environment where the body politic in Israel still suffers the trauma of October 7th for a lot of reasons I can explain. But by the way, Palestinians too now have their own trauma. And those who suffer from trauma are consumed by their own pain and incapable of recognizing anybody else's. So to get from where we are to where we need to go will take time and a very conscious effort, but we can get into that, the ins and outs of that.
I'll soon go to that, into the ins and out of that. But beforehand, I want to again go back a bit in history, because you've mentioned the Second Intifada and Arafat as the major shifting point. But ever since the Second Intifada, there's been almost 2 decades, and those 2 decades couldn't change. We couldn't see any change in your perspective, or what led to the fact that after the Great Shift, no change has been made?
Yeah. Well, you're asking two different kinds of questions. One relates to my views, and the other relates to why there's been no changes. Let me start with my views. I start from a premise that we have two national movements competing for the same space. I start from a premise that the national identities of both are deeply rooted and tied to the land. The idea that you can have one state, and this is something that doesn't get discussed, but it needs to be, especially in Israel. One state is a guarantee for a forever conflict. And I say that precisely for the reasons I said. Neither national identity is going to disappear. People like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir somehow feel the Palestinians will give up. They can be, quote, encouraged to leave, and that'll be the end of any kind of Palestinian nationalism. They live in a fantasy world. I would suggest they read Jabotinsky's Iron Wall, because he talks about we shouldn't assume that their attachment to the land, the Arab attachment to the land, is any less than ours. And the reality is, you are not going to have one state where each side simply coexists with the other and accepts that it's okay for them not to really be able to express that national identity. So one state is a guarantee for a forever war. And part of the problem in Israel is there's never been a serious debate about what the relationship with Palestinians should be. I mean, the Oslo didn't produce a debate, it produced opposition, not a debate. The withdrawal from Gaza, Sharon's withdrawal from Gaza, was a decision by him. Didn't produce a debate, it produced opposition. There needs to be a discussion of what should the relationship with Palestinians be, based on a premise. They're not going anyplace. They're not going to disappear, and they're not going anyplace. Now, they have to change, and there is not a structure for soul searching on the Palestinian side. But before any of that, Israel does have a structure where there can be soul searching. There just hasn't been it. Now, presumably, there'll be at some point a reckoning for October 7th. And that will be a prelude, I think, to having that discussion. But to get from where we are to where we need to go, there needs to be a recognition of why one state is simply not realistic. And it's, you have the right and the left on one state. The right thinks you can have one state because the Palestinians will accept the fact that they have been defeated, and they'll either leave or they'll simply accept that they have a kind of subordinate status, a secondary status. the left thinks that everybody's going to come together and sing Kumbaya, and each side national identity doesn't mean anything. And you can have one state where everybody's equal. They both live in fantasy land. And so part of getting back to the idea of legitimizing the idea of two states for Israelis and Palestinians, because both question it now, not just the Israelis, the Palestinians too. But we can't get back to that point unless we have this discussion that points out why one state is a prescription for ongoing war, not a prescription for a solution.
And so if to go on from that, how do you see us, the Israeli society, that's so deeply divided right now and so deeply mourns the horrific attacks of October 7, in days in which most Israelis still live as the same day today, even though it's already been a year and more than 3 months? How do you see us moving as a society towards the idea that you're describing as it is the solution?
It's a good question. I try in my own mind to think about why is it that it's still October 7th, 2023 in Israel? It's not January 9th, 2025.
Yeah.
First, because of hostages. Until the issue of hostages is resolved, it's very difficult to move beyond October 7th. Secondly, there has been no explanation, not for the surprise. Strategic surprise has a common characteristic. You have groupthink, you have a set of assumptions that basically create a prism through which you see reality, and you interpret information only one way. Every case of strategic surprise is the same. All the information you needed to have to be able to prevent the surprise you had, but it was misinterpreted and discounted. And the third element is no accountability. When I say no explanation, what I'm referring to is not the surprise, I'm referring to why did it take the better part of a day for the IDF to respond? It still is. When you talk to people in the South, you're talking like close to 12 hours. A, the country is not that big, and B, why was it so hard for the IDF to organize a response? You had a response, but it was mostly heroic and actions of individuals, not an organized response. And there needs to be an explanation for that. But then there needs to be accountability. And that accountability needs to be, frankly, not just the military intelligence, but also the political leadership. The worst day in Israel's history by far. It's unthinkable there won't be accountability. You have to get beyond all those three factors before you can begin to have change in Israel. You can't break free of that until the hostages have been, the truth is the hostages have been, the live and the dead have been released and or recovered. A clear explanation for what went wrong with the IDF. And there'll be part of the accountability will be, the explanation as well of why the intelligence was so flawed, especially at a time when we've now suddenly seen how deeply penetrated Hezbollah was, how deeply penetrated Iran is. You can kill the leader of Hamas in a Revolutionary Guard safe house in Tehran at a time when there's the inauguration of an Iranian president, and the only person that gets killed is Haniya and his bodyguard. That's it. And this kind of intelligence is literally stunning. The pagers in Lebanon and Hezbollah, it's stunning, but frankly, it's not as stunning as being able to take out the entire leadership of Hezbollah. So the contrast with that level of intelligence and the absence of it in the case of Hamas, speaks volumes about kind of what's known as the concepcia. You didn't have to worry somehow they were deterred. You didn't have to worry about them. Okay, all this has to come out because you can't come to grips with what happened until until you get beyond the traumas, and you can't get beyond the traumas if there isn't any accountability.
And so do you think those three things would happen? Will we have accountability, and will we know what happened, and will we have finally a hostage deal?
You're gonna get to a hostage outcome. What I don't know is I will say, look, I favor getting any deal because what the live hostages have lived through, none of us can imagine. It literally is beyond our comprehension to imagine what they've had to live through, what they've been subjected to, and whether it's possible for any human being to recover from what they've been through. So I want any deal that's possible. I tend to agree with the hostage families that it's better to simply declare we're ready to end the war provided all the hostages are released. The unwillingness to declare an end to the war, we can go through Prime Minister Netanyahu's calculations. I'm happy to go through what I think they are. In the end, I also see a reality on the ground in Gaza today where you have succeeded in destroying Hamas as a military. Israel has succeeded in destroying most of the military infrastructure, meaning the weapons depots, the weapons labs, the weapon production facilities. Probably 60 to 65% of all the tunnels have been destroyed. What you need is to be able to get out of Gaza, but then ensure you don't leave a vacuum. And there's a transitional administration for the next 18 to 24 months. That is possible. It is possible. I can tell you the Biden administration was actually quite close to an understanding on this with the Israelis and with the Emiratis and with others.
What was the model of the Biden administration?
A transitional administration that would be headed by a broad international regional council, the Emirates, the Egyptians, the Moroccans, maybe the Bahrainis, some Europeans with a US role to create management, law and order, the beginning of a process of rehabilitation and reconstruction, a phased in involvement of those from the region, a phased out withdrawal by the IDF. I mean, that was the structure of what they were working on. I think, it's hard to imagine the Trump administration won't want to embrace that. The near-term deal doesn't change that because let's say you get the partial deal. And I think the chances of it are fairly high. I mean, when I say fairly high, more than 50%. I mean, when you deal in the world of Middle East, when you say something's more than 50%, that's fairly high. I think it's because Hamas probably concludes it's better to do it right on the eve of Trump coming in, because then it won't be so easy for Israel to resume the war. Netanyahu says we're not ending the war, we'll resume it because that relates to the politics of his coalition. But I think there's an assumption here, once you start it, once you have a pause, it won't be so simple to resume it. Now that may prove not to be true. That's why I would still prefer to see you declare you're ready to end the war, provided the hostage release. That will reframe the issue and put enormous pressure on Hamas beyond the pressure that's there. I do think that there's a Trump effect right now. I think the Qataris, the Egyptians, and even Turkey all see, that there's a problem they could have with Trump unless they can deliver something. I also think that Bibi will have a very hard time saying no to Trump. So there's a combination here that probably increases the prospects that we'll see something. The critical question, however, will be what comes next, and whether the Trump administration will embrace what the what the Biden administration was working on remains to be seen. If it doesn't, and Israel stays, it's hard for Israel then to get out. And as long as Israel is there, Israel will face an insurgency. The military benefits that you get will be marginal. The costs will go up. So I don't see the idea that, the IDF is back in Jabalia, by my count, the 5th time. The idea of what David Petraeus' concept of clear, hold, and build was never done. So Israel keeps having to come back in and clear. And the longer it's there, the mood in Gaza is profoundly anti-Hamas right now. But that doesn't mean that they can't recruit younger people. And that's why you have an insurgency. You don't have an organized military, but you have an insurgency. And they still have enough weapons. Because one of the things, in many ways, it was a mistake not to go into Rafah early on in the war, to cut off the smuggling. Look, it's true. Bibi says, look, he overcame American opposition. I can tell you there was no American opposition in the first month or two to going into Rafah, because the administration wasn't even focused on it. But apparently either was Israel, and it should have been. So you have to cut off the smuggling. You cut off the smuggling. You need you need a new administration, a transitional administration. It can't be the PA, not because ultimately the PA shouldn't come back in, but because the PA is too weak and too corrupt to play that role. You need a transitional administration that can, over time, and incrementally, the PA can gradually come back in. But the PA can't come in until it is genuinely reformed.
Do you see a future in which it would be that reform that it could get back to full power in Gaza?
Yes, it could. It could. You have to understand, there was a poll that Zogby did for the Blair Global Institute about 6 weeks ago. It said 7% of the Gazan population wants Hamas to stay in control. 7%. 3 weeks ago, the most important Islamic scholar in Gaza accused Hamas of violating the basic principles of jihad. And the basic principles of jihad is you don't subject your civilian population to destruction. So, the fact that he would come out and say that, it's extraordinary. But the problem is, as long as Israel's there, you have younger people who will continue to be drawn in, and you make, life is, the reality. Israelis don't see what's going on in Gaza. I don't need to tell you, they don't see it. And then partly when you're suffering from trauma, as I said, you can't absorb anybody else's pain. But Palestinians in the Arab world, that's the only thing they see. That's why, you won't get Saudi normalization until Israel's out of Gaza. And by the way, that's a necessary, not a sufficient condition.
Mm-hmm. You've touched a bit about the entering of the Trump administration in 11 days from now. Are you more afraid or are you more expecting it? Like, is the future brighter or worse in regarding to the conflict?
The short answer is he comes in with a very interesting potential in the region, precisely because Israel's military achievements are simply stunning. And they have changed the balance of power in the region. The good news is they have changed the balance of power in the region. The bad news is they're tactical gains right now. They're not strategic gains, because there has to be a political strategy to transform them into something more enduring. So Trump comes in with the potential to do that. He has leverage on anybody, at least in the near term. I don't know how long the leverage lasts. So he needs to get things done while he has that leverage. That's why, in my mind, there are two strategic imperatives for 2025. The first is to end the war in Gaza and have Israel out of Gaza. because there will not be normalization with Saudi Arabia, which is what Trump wants. Again, Trump defines himself as a peacemaker. He said the world, the world was characterized by war during Biden. He wants to show with him it's peace. He said that Ukraine is hard, the Middle East is easy. I can say the Middle East is not easy, but if he can certainly make it more doable if he uses the leverage that he has. So it starts with, you're going to have to end the war in Gaza and Israel has to be out. But that means you put together an administration so there is no vacuum. You leave a vacuum there, and it's either Hamas or Hamas-like groups again, or it's Somalia on Israel's border. But the other thing is you also have to deal in a decisive way with the Iranian nuclear program. You have to do that because by the year 2026, they, aside from the fact that they have accumulated at least 11 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium near weapons grade. That's not a bomb, but it's the hardest thing to put together for a bomb. You need the metallurgy, you need to create these metal spheres, you need neutron initiators to create a chain reaction, but those are all doable things.
Not
Accumulating accumulating the weapons grade material or near weapons grade material, that's the hard thing. That they basically have already solved. And they're creating in Natanz. There are two enrichment facilities. The large enrichment facility is in Natanz. They're seeking to create an underground facility there that's 80 meters underground. We have something called a massive ordnance penetrator that could destroy Fordo. It's a 30,000-pound bomb that has a fuse that doesn't ignite until it's deep underground. It was developed during the Obama administration. It could destroy Fordo. Israel can't destroy Fordo. But we could destroy Fordo. But we could not, if they build this facility at Natanz that's 80 meters underground, even the MOP doesn't work against that. Maybe they can achieve it by 2026. Maybe they can't, but if they can, then they have an invulnerable facility for enrichment. Then you can't stop their nuclear program. So you need to get this done during 2025. Trump comes in and he wants to be the deal maker. He said he could, if he'd had a second term, he would have done a deal with the Iranians. He can take advantage of the two things that he's going to do, I suspect. One is he'll return to maximum pressure, which for him has always been economic pressure. And they're hurting right now. I can get into the details of that if you want.
Yeah, a few words. I think that it's interesting.
Sorry?
I think that it's interesting. Go. You may proceed.
All right, so look, why are they are especially vulnerable domestically? I want everybody to think about the reality. They have profound electricity shortages right now. So much so that they had to shut down their schools. So much so that they had to shut down a lot of industries. And the reason they had to do that is because if they didn't do that, then they couldn't provide heat to homes. And they feared, justifiably, what the reaction to that would be. They are a natural gas and oil producing country, and they can't provide for their own electricity. They made this decision to do the homes because they feared a backlash. The proof, again, of their fear of the public right now is that because there were boycotts of the elections for the parliament last March, it's the hard line that dominates the parliament. They passed a new punitive hijab law. The president, Pezeshkian, and the Supreme National Security Council agreed that they won't implement it. Why would they agree not to implement it? Because they're fearful of triggering another women life freedom explosion. So they have reasons. They are vulnerable because of what Israel did to take out their strategic air and missile defenses and the destruction of 90% of their missile producing capability. And they're vulnerable because of what they feel on the inside. That isn't to say, I don't think, they follow the model of the collapse of the regime the way you saw it in Syria. There is no opposition that controls a corner of the country the way HTS controlled a corner of the northwest corner of Syria, thanks to a deal that was done by Turkey and Russia. And they used the last 3.5 years to build up their capability, much the way, by the way, Hamas did in Gaza. I don't think the Iranian regime is nearly as brittle and fragile as Assad's was. But, no one is good at predicting regime change. What matters is they may feel vulnerable. And the fact is they're signaling they're prepared to talk to the Trump administration when they wouldn't talk directly to the Biden administration, ever. One of the big mistakes the Biden administration made from the outset was accepting a format for negotiations where they wouldn't talk directly to us, only through the Europeans. Why would you allow them to define that? It's, anyway, the point is, Trump comes in and they're weak and they're vulnerable. Doesn't mean they might not look for ways to counteract their losses. The fact that you are now intercepting large amounts of arms shipments into the West Bank, those shipments are also not just geared to the West Bank, they're geared towards Jordan. And so, one way they could try to say, okay, we're not totally on the losing end, is to try to undermine Jordan and to try to further deal with and raise the price of violence that Israel faces in the West Bank, with an Israeli government, with a coalition that has only one answer to increasing violence, and it's violence. And it's not to say that that doesn't play a role, but if you give Palestinians nothing and no prospect, no hope, and nothing but the iron fist with no alternative, well, you're going to continue to produce those people who are prepared to go take advantage of the weapons that can be smuggled in there.
Ambassador Ross will, in 1 minute, go to the questions from the crowd, as I see that we have many. But the last question I want to ask shortly, we're in a conversation here with a lot of rabbis and supporters of our movement in the US. And as a grandfather who has recently been in Israel in a bar mitzvah, as a supporter of our movement yourself, how do you see the role of the American Reform movement in Israel and in the Israeli society today?
The reason I'm speaking to this group is because the reform rabbi who presided over my grandson's bar mitzvah in Ramat Aviv, asked if I would speak to the group, and I said yes.
And Rabbi Rachel is with us, and this is an opportunity to say to Rachel, thank you very much for leading the bar mitzvah and doing such a beautiful and really a wonderful job in Ramat Aviv for a few years. Rachel is moving to work with the Israeli Association for Civil Rights, and Ofer is replacing her. So Ofer, good luck, as I said earlier.
Right, but I understand she's prepared to do the other two boys, so we're going to hold it to that.
She will be there.
Okay. Look, I think we have a role to play, meaning the American-Israeli sort of connection, the American Jewish presence in Israel. I'm talking more about the presence in Israel than the diaspora per se. Look, there's a struggle in Israel for the soul of Israel. And I think that there has to be, the fact that you live in Israel, the argument that's always been made, which is a legitimate argument, by the way, if you don't live in Israel and your kids aren't serving in the military, you don't really have a right to tell the Israelis how they're gonna deal with the reality of the Middle East that they face. But you are in Israel, and your kids do serve in the military. And I'm looking at 3 grandsons who are going to be in the Israeli military. And by the way, they won't be exempted. At a time when it's just, the burden that falls on everyone but the Haredi is not sustainable. I was in Israel for 3 weeks. I only got back day before yesterday. One of the things I went to the north, I went to the border, I went to Metula. I also went to the base where a lot of the captured weapons are from Hezbollah, which, by the way, that's also stunning. It's interesting, when Nasrallah was killed, it had a huge effect on the morale of the Hezbollah fighters. And one of the explanations for seeing so many of the weapon systems completely intact. Means they didn't all disappear, but a lot of them did. In any case, the military guys I spoke to there, one of them as a reservist who has been in active duty since October 7, 2023. He's a reservist, no break. And he said to me, not sustainable. All the people who are my son I've talked to, who's in his early 40s, I talked to a lot of the friends that he has who've had, been in 200, 300 days. It's not sustainable. And this is a left-right issue. It's not only a left issue. You look at this, the women's groups who are religious Zionists who are saying not acceptable. So this is one of the areas that's worth weighing in on, because this is a broad consensus in Israel, and the idea of legislation, the idea that you're going to, you'll say, yes, they're going to be drafted now. If there is no consequence for not showing up, then it's a sham. And that looks to be what this legislation is. You can claim it's something, but the people who are continuing to pay the price, they're going to know it's a sham. This is part of the struggle for the soul and identity of Israel, and you need to be part of it. And it's just you're not on one side of the society. You're connecting to what is a broad consensus in society, and you have a right to be a part of it. You have a need to be a part of it.
Ambassador Ross, thank you so much. I give it up to Edith for questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. This is really, we have quite a few questions, and this is what the goal and hope of our sessions are. So I'm going to try to have the questions in order, just to keep the flow going. So our first question was from Elizabeth Goldbaum, which was, is Ambassador Ross familiar both with the Wilson Center's post-war Gaza plan and the former Prime Minister Omer PA Foreign Affairs Minister Al-Kidwa's post-war proposal? Both make an attempt at temporary interim governing plan for Gaza. The Omot plan addresses West Bank too. The Wilson Center does not. Neither recommend PA governance.
I'm familiar with both. The Wilson Center plan is, it has a lot in it that commends it, but it's based on a premise that the U.S. will put boots on the ground in Gaza as a way of ensuring that you take care of making sure that Hamas couldn't make a comeback. Biden wasn't prepared to put American boots on the ground, although he was prepared to do quite a bit. I think Trump, who prides himself on not being involved in the forever wars, there's very little prospect that Trump will agree to that. The Kidwa Omer proposal, I'm familiar with. It's not that the good news about it is you have the nephew of Yasser Arafat is embracing an approach to peace that is not one of slogans. The problem with Abu Mazen is it's all slogans. Kidwa's is not. The problem is neither public's ready for it. You have to do more preparatory work on the ground to legitimize this. To come in at this point without the preparatory work, it's just not going to strike the kind of chord that it needs to. For me, the preparatory work focuses on, one, how do you reestablish, there is functional cooperation today, but it has no visibility. There's functional cooperation on health, functional cooperation on water. Between Israelis and Palestinians, it needs to be given visibility, because both publics need to see that it's possible to cooperate and benefit from it. That's an essential starting point. Secondly, you need to use the prospect of Saudi normalization as a way of also creating what is the leverage to move Israel. The reality is they will not normalize with Israel. I've said without an end to the war, but they're not going to normalize with Israel without something that signals there's a pathway to a Palestinian state. Now, the Trump administration, President Trump may come in and say, you know, the Trump plan, which was rejected by at least half of the settler community because it called for 2 states. You know, you could say the Palestinians rejected it out of hand, even though I remember Jared Kushner at the time was saying, this is an initial proposal, give us a counter proposal. They never did. They sort of excel in the Abba Eban adage that they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And, you know, having said that, I'm sure that Trump's point of departure is the Trump peace plan, which had an economic dimension, but it also provided for a Palestinian state. In about 70% of the West Bank, with taking 10% of the territory Israel next to Gaza and expanding Gaza. Now it did the hardest element in it, which I'm not sure the Saudis would be so quick to embrace, is that all 120 settlements, including the 75, there are 130 settlements, including the 75 that are to the east of the security barrier, would remain in Israel. So that would carve up the territory in a way that you'd have a Palestinian state, but it would be basically these islands of Palestinian sovereignty. You know, you can raise questions about that, but the truth is you start with a premise where he's talking about a state which is obviously rejected from the right wing of the coalition. So you know, you have the Trump plan, you do the functional cooperation. I would like to get to the point where you do something that hasn't been done before. It will take time, but you establish the idea of recognition based on mutual legitimacy. The mutual recognition that was done on September 9th, 1993, was a recognition of the fact of each other, not the legitimacy of each other. The Palestinians never acknowledged, much less accepted, the historic Jewish connection to the land, which means that Israel has a right to be there. It's not just there as a function of a fact that was created. But the Israelis never recognized the Palestinians as the people who have a right to self-determination. Now, they can't act on that right of self-determination unless they're prepared to demonstrate a variety of things, including, for one, that the narrative is no longer resistance as opposed to coexistence, including that there can't be independent militias, not just verbally, but in fact, and they will ensure that they won't join with rejectionists against Israel. There can't be alliances of that sort. That there has to be the kind of reform, because otherwise a Palestinian state tomorrow would be a failed state. So there's a series of conditions that have to be met. But my point is, at some point, you have to get to the idea not just of mutual recognition of each other as facts, but mutual recognition of each other as having a right to be there. These are the ways you can transform where we are to where we need to be.
Indeed, the next
Thank
question.
you. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was just muting. Alan Warshaw asks, do you have any comments about the apparent collaboration between Biden and the Trump transition teams on behalf of getting the hostages out? Is there something that could be done better? And then another follow-up question, similar, dealing with Trump, is from Eugene Sofer. To what degree is Trump and Netanyahu, et cetera, constrained by the realities of domestic Israeli politics and the leverage the far right has over the coalition? Can the far right veto a deal?
I think if they veto, let me put it this way. I think there has been cooperation, meaning the Biden administration kept the Trump people informed of what was going on in terms of two things. One, the negotiations in Lebanon to produce a ceasefire, and two, the efforts to get the hostages back. You have Witkoff now flying to Qatar to join the negotiations. So that shows a level of cooperation. It was, I think there hasn't really been cooperation on what the Biden administration was trying to do in terms of the transitional administration. There wasn't opposition, but there wasn't cooperation either. I would say, as it relates to the hostages, the cooperation probably couldn't have been much improved on. I think that Trump is making the threats. It says Trump, to his credit, he understands the concept of leverage. The question is, does he always know how to exercise the concept of leverage? What I was saying earlier, I think he will use financial pressure and the threat of Israeli use of force to try to move the Iranians to a deal. The issue will be, will he be willing to define what is an acceptable deal in the same way the Israelis would define an acceptable deal? That I'm not right now going in. I'm not sure that's true, but we'll see what happens. On the issue of the hostages, and this gets to the heart of the question, can the far right of the coalition veto? Let's put it this way, if they're vetoing what he wants, I think there'll be a price to be paid. I don't think Bibi can say no to him, and I think Bibi is concerned about the consequences of saying no to him. It will be easier for Bibi to make a choice between Trump and Ben-Gvir than it was for Bibi to make a choice between Biden and Ben-Gvir. Though from time to time, he gave in to some of the pressures of the administration. The issue of humanitarian assistance, the argument of those who say, look, if we just put a siege on Gaza, that would force Hamas to collapse. On what basis do they say it? When has Hamas ever shown, since October 7th, shown the slightest concern about the well-being of Palestinians? The 350 miles of tunnels they had, no Palestinians who lived there were allowed in them. The idea that you'll have a siege and they'll have no choice but to give in. Why? That assumes that what happens to the fate of Palestinians in Gaza matters to Hamas. They have treated the population in Hamas as if they were martyrs all along. They never asked them if they wanted to be martyrs. So this notion, if we just squeeze them harder, we'll produce an outcome. If we just put more military pressure on them, you're 461 days into this. You haven't had a hostage deal since November of 2023. So, there's an illusion here. The reason I think that in the end, he's more likely to respond to Trump, because I think Trump is much less willing. Trump has no problem providing political support, symbolic support. But will Trump be as open providing, the costs? He's big on political support. He's not real big on monies. The notion that he will, that they're on the right, that they'll have a blank check and they can go ahead and annex. They annex, that's the end of the expansion of the Abraham Accords. That's the end of any Saudi deal. That's what Trump wants. So, I was interviewed at one point on Israeli TV, and I was asked about the positions of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and I said, I guess the thing I missed, I didn't understand that Israel was a superpower. They seem to think Israel's a superpower. They're not. They need the United States. And Trump tends to look at alliances as, what are you going to do for us? Not what are we going to do for you? Mm-hmm. Israel has something to do. They can deal with the Iranian nuclear program with American political backing. And he wants to deal with it, but he wants to use that threat. So Israel has something to offer, but so does he. And I do think, the one big issue for Bibi, the Winston Churchill issue for Bibi has always been Iran. That, in my mind, if Trump says, I need you to do this in Gaza, and here's what I need on the Palestinians, but here's what I'm prepared to do with you to deal with Iran and the nuclear program, that's a trade-off I see Bibi making.
Oh,
great. Well, I think we are so close to time, and we're so grateful, Ambassador Ross, for the time you've spent, the answering our questions. We have more, but I'm so sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. And we're just very grateful for your time, your insights, and thoughts going forward.